A very good morning to you all. Welcome back. You're watching World News and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has signed a controversial bill which reduces the independence of Ukraine's top anti-corruption agencies. Earlier this week, Ukraine's security services made a series of arrests and raids targeting the country's top anti-corruption body. The new legislation comes despite widespread protests erupting across the country on Tuesday and warnings from the European Union. Our correspondent Oz Kataji is in Kyiv. Good morning, Oz. So why is the Ukrainian government going against the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and what will be the consequence of the move, considering all the backlash we've seen so far?
Well, look, this situation is creating the first signs of a major public backlash against Zelenskyy and his administration since the start of the full-scale invasion. It should be noted that under martial law, which Ukraine is under, protests are illegal. So protesters defied that law in order to gather near the presidential administration. I was there in Kyiv on Tuesday night, and they defied curfew to stay out protesting against this law. Protests were also taking place across Ukraine. Lviv had protests too, with further protests expected to be called as a result of Zelensky signing this bill into law. Now, President Zelenskyy alleges that these two anti-corruption bodies had Russian interference with them and that they were pointlessly prosecuting people abroad. He released a statement in the early hours of Wednesday morning, much later than he normally releases his nightly statements. Let's take a listen to his justifications for signing that law into passage.
The anti-corruption infrastructure will work. However, we need to remove all Russian influence. There should also be more justice. Of course, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office will play their part. It is also important that the Prosecutor General is determined to ensure that those who break the law in Ukraine are actually punished. This is what Ukraine really needs. Cases that have been lying dormant must be investigated. For years, officials who fled Ukraine have been living abroad without facing legal consequences in very nice countries. This is not normal. There is no rational explanation for why criminal proceedings with billions have been languishing for years, nor is there an explanation as to why the Russians can still access the information they need. It is important to do this independently of the Russians. It is important that society sees the inevitability of punishment.
So Zelensky's statement there, I do not think that it goes far enough to address the concerns of the protesters. They see this as the government stripping the independence away from these bodies, handing them to the Prosecutor General, who is obviously closely aligned with the president. So there is worries here about the Ukraine's fragile democracy and democratic processes and institutions with regards to this bill. But look, either way, we are facing a difficult moment for Zelenskyy politically, domestically. One of the first signs of any kind of problems for a government coming deep into the war so far. Again, with no kind of elections on the horizon, this is going to be a headache for Zelenskyy to try and solve. Now, some European nations have called for the Ukrainian government to U-turn on this decision. And with regards to the protest, Kirill Budanov, the military intelligence chief of Ukraine, said that internal contradictions should be resolved through open dialogue, warning that differences of opinion in Ukraine risk splitting and fragmenting Ukrainian politics, making it more difficult to defend the country. The Ukrainian government is in a difficult position here. The Europeans don't seem happy with the decision. The Ukrainian people don't seem happy with the decision. But so far, the president's office seems happy enough to continue along pushing through this bill, despite how unpopular it seems to be. The question is, will protests continue at the same pace as they had last night? And will that start to influence public opinion and put pressure on the government to change its decision? Back to you, Claudia.
Thank you so much, Oz. That was Oz Kataji reporting live from Kyiv. And we continue on the topic of the bill. EU Enlargement Commissioner Marta Kos has criticized the Ukrainian government for passing that very bill that critics say undermines the independence of anti-corruption investigators. Taking to social media, Kos called the newly passed bill a dismantling of key safeguards protecting Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Bureau. She warned that the independence of independent investigative agencies would be essential for Ukraine's path to join the European Union. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy signed a controversial bill on Tuesday that places anti-corruption agencies under the Prosecutor General, adding government oversight. He argues that cases have been stagnant for years, suggesting Russian influence is to blame. The bill sparked protests in Ukraine, the first since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. Ukrainian and Russian delegations are to hold peace talks in Istanbul today. This will be the third round of negotiations between both countries this year.
The meeting, which will be held in Istanbul's Turan Palace, was initiated by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who said last Saturday he wants to accelerate negotiations for a ceasefire. Although Moscow accepted the invitation, it also sent a message to not expect miracles from this round of negotiations. All this amid US President Donald Trump issuing an ultimatum for Russia earlier this month to reach a ceasefire agreement within 50 days.
A major reshuffle of the Polish government is set to take place today as Prime Minister Donald Tusk is expected to announce key structural changes aimed at regaining the initiative following the loss of this year's presidential election and giving the government a new direction. As part of the overhaul announced by Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, several ministerial positions without portfolios are expected to be eliminated. The most significant changes include the creation of two large new ministries, one focused on the economy and the other on energy. Andrius Kubilius, the current head of the Ministry of Finance, is widely expected to lead the new economic ministry. And this very moment, we actually see Prime Minister Donald Tusk speaking to those who gathered to listen about the changes that are going to be implemented. And as I said before, Mr. Andrius Kubilius, the current head of the Ministry of Finance, is widely expected to lead the new economic ministry, which could absorb several existing departments. One of the most significant changes is the potential move of Radosław Sikorski, Poland's foreign minister, to the role of deputy prime minister, a position Mr. Tusk has suggested. The reshuffle reflects Tusk's broader goal to reduce the size of the government, with the number of ministers and deputy ministers expected to drop below 100, making Poland one of the smallest governments in Europe in terms of structure. So as of now, we can see that there is going to be an announcement made by Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who gathered his ministers in order to announce a reshuffle. And we will be bringing you more news on who is going to take new positions in office and what shifts and changes we're going to see Actually, at 11 a.m., we'll be able to bring you more details on what's going to happen within the Polish government and what the announcement is going to be by Prime Minister Donald Tusk. Russia is moving toward a year-round draft as it faces mounting losses in Ukraine. A new bill introduced by the State Duma on Tuesday aims to expand Russia's seasonal military mobilization into a continuous year-long effort. This comes as Russian forces have suffered over 1 million casualties since the war began. Russia's State Duma has submitted a bill to make the country's military conscription a year-round process, signaling the Kremlin's attempt to bolster its dwindling forces in Ukraine. If passed, this law would allow the Russian government to draft citizens throughout the year, with conscription still occurring in two main periods, from April to July and October to December. The bill, which was developed under Vladimir Putin's directive, aims to streamline the process and ensure a constant flow of troops to the front lines. This move comes as Russia grapples with significant military losses in Ukraine, with the Ukrainian General Staff reporting that Russia has lost over 1 million troops since the start of its full-scale invasion. The number of Russian military personnel killed is now nearing 120,000, with independent Russian outlets such as Mediazona confirming the identities of many of the fallen. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has said that EU is entering a decisive phase in the customs dispute with the United States. He went on to add that if the dispute is not settled, it will cause greater damage than it already has to consumers on both sides of the Atlantic.
We are now approaching the decisive phase in the customs dispute with the USA. We need a fair, reliable agreement with low tariffs. This trade policy between the partners, between America and Europe, must strengthen the transatlantic market and not weaken it. Otherwise, this dispute will cause even greater damage than it already has, especially for consumers on both sides of the Atlantic.
The 30th EU-Japan summit in Tokyo will soon begin. The European Union will be represented by the heads of the European Council and the European Commission, Antonio Costa and Ursula von der Leyen. During the summit, they will hold discussions with the Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba on topics such as energy security and the war in Ukraine. The meeting comes amid political turbulence in Japan. Last week, Prime Minister Ishiba lost the majority in the parliament, and according to press reports, he is expected to resign by the end of the month. EU officials expect Japan to join new sanctions on Russian oil. Japan regularly toughens its stance on Russia and imposes new sanctions. In January 2025, Japan introduced sanctions on Russian diamond sales, as well as banned 63 Japanese companies from exporting their products to the Russian Federation. The leaders are expected to announce the creation of a competitiveness alliance between the EU and Japan to bolster industries of both places. As stated by Antonio Costa, the alliance would be the most important result of the talks. After discussions in Tokyo, the European leaders will travel to Beijing for the 25th EU-China summit.
It's never been as intense in terms of trade, because in spite of every problems, trade is growing, and particularly China's sales to Europe, of course, it's asymmetrical, and it's never been so strategically tense. We don't only have trade issue, we have the issue of a Chinese foreign minister declaring quite openly to an EU official that China cannot tolerate a loss of Russia, a defeat of Russia in Ukraine. That's departing, of course, from the neutrality that China claims.
According to Microsoft, Chinese hackers were behind the recent attack on the company's SharePoint collaboration software. Victims of the attack include several multinational organizations, national government entities, and banks primarily based in the US, Germany, France, and Austria. According to the press release published by Microsoft, Chinese groups called Linen Typhoon and Violet Typhoon have been trying to exploit vulnerabilities in the software since July 7th. While the flaw in the software let hackers gain significant access to the computers of organizations that host SharePoint servers, cloud customers were not affected. The attack came after the company said last week it would stop relying on engineers based in China to support use of cloud services by the U.S. Department of Defense. Greek authorities arrested Moldovan oligarch Vladimir Plahotniuc, who suspected of defrauding banks of over $1 billion. Plahotniuc was put on Interpol's wanted list in February this year and was subject to US and UK sanctions over alleged corruption and efforts to illegally influence Moldovan elections.
Following Plahotniuc's arrest at Athens' Eleftherios Venizelos International Airport, the Greek police entered the premises of his house in the Athenian suburbs. Their officers found 17 forged passports from multiple different countries, over 150,000 euros in cash, encoded USB and SSD drives, as well as multiple cell phones and computers. In addition to allegations of financial crimes, Plahotniuc faced accusations in Moldova of undermining the judiciary and media, all while being involved in a Russian attempt to destabilize Moldovan politics.
And so this would be all for now. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska, and I do hope to see you back here on TVP World for more news and features.